Non-Americans, how was 9/11 displayed in your country? Serious. Canadian. Woke up to the radio station mentioning all about it, arrived to my grade 8 class, and my teacher let us watch 20 minutes of it after the national anthem. Then he turned it off. When we asked why we couldn't watch anymore, he responded with, "You will watch that footage for the rest of your life. Terrible things have happened and there are no answers. Let's move on and check in at lunchtime. You will watch that footage for the rest of your life." I don't mean to be insensitive, but that level of foreshadowing is brutal. I'm from Chile, and while our local press did continuous coverage, it wasn't with any specific focus on anything, save for the occasional we found a Chilean in New York who can tell us about what's happening on the ground. The surreal part for me was that our cable TV started replacing almost every international channel with whatever US media they could get their hands on. Watching MTV Latino turn into a live, untranslated feed of a New York Fox affiliate was incredibly strange, and it has never happened again for any global event. Same with Fox TV and Sony Latin, which mostly broadcast sitcoms and movies. The attack was literally in every channel. The way these US channels were reporting the news was so unknown to us that by 2 or 3 p.m. I really felt like there was a chance of some ICBMs being launched. It was scary on a global level. In France, I was 18. I remember very clearly channel surfing and stopping on what looked like a very bad TV drama with a newscaster I had never seen before talking over the image of the first tower burning. It took me a few minutes to realize that was actual footage they were looping. The news was talking about how this was the largest attack on American soil, that no one knew who or why it had been done. Then the second plane hit and everyone lost their mind. The journalists were going ape crap and I just remember the shock. I could not tell you the tone they had, even if it was probably very sympathetic towards the victims, especially when the images of people jumping started to arrive. But I was just incredulous. It looked like fiction from there. It was hard to believe something like that could happen. After the attack, new terms started to appear on TV. Bin Laden, Al-Qaeda, etc. We had not seen those before on French TV. I remember that a math test was cancelled the next day, my teacher saying we are all too shocked to study. I also remember the front page of Le Monde saying now somos tous Americains. We are all American. I am a Turkish Muslim guy from Germany and I was in middle school that time. I remember coming home from school and seeing my parents sitting in front of the TV. They did not even notice that I came home and I knew from their face expressions that something terrible happened. My mum was crying when the media showed footage of people jumping from the Twin Towers. After we knew that it was a terror act by radical Islamists, my dad said that also life for us Muslims would never be the same as before. He sat down and explained me the difference between us Muslims and what radicalism is, and that the terrorists who did that just harm our religion. After that day, every time something shows up in media about a terror attack or a tragedy, my parents hope that it wasn't done by some douchebag terrorists who claim that they are Muslims. I was 15 in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. I remember watching live footage of it on TV. The local channels had suspended usual programming to report breaking news from the US. I can't remember exactly, but I think they were showing footage from CNN, replaying the same few minutes of the second plane hitting the towers and afterwards, the collapse of the towers. The next day all the local papers had a picture of the smoking towers with the explosion from the second plane hitting, mostly with estimates on the loss of life and chaos that was going on in New York and the rest of the country. Outside official news channels, the rumor mill immediately started churning and I was quite convinced at one point that this would result in World War III and we were all going to die. Malaysian here too. Jeff, this thread reminded me of my jackass neighbors. They're very anti-West and freaking cheered when they heard about 9/11. Frick. I'm an American, but I was in Germany at the time. Some colleagues rushed into the room, interrupting my meeting and told me, "You have to go. You have to leave right now. Your country is under attack." I wasn't sure what they were talking about. It seemed so strange to hear those words. I couldn't really process it. They rushed me to a TV in the building lobby and stood there with me. So many people held my hands, or put their hand on my shoulder, or hugged me, or cried with me. I was just in shock. When the shock wore off, I turned to a woman on my right and said, "My friend works there." She asked me for her number and dozens of people ran to the phones to try to call her. Strangers frantically dialed her number for over an hour before there was a whoop of joy when one finally got through to her. Word spread through the group and a cheer went up as people ran through the group to tell me that someone had spoken to her and she was safe. They stood there with me, dozens upon dozens of colleagues, for hours. As the news spread around the office complex that there was an American in the lobby, they brought food and coffee, chairs, a blanket, handwritten cards and notes. I had offers to stay with people I didn't know, to come for dinner. They offered to bring me clothes and toiletries as they realized I wouldn't be able to fly home anytime soon. Overwhelming. Ugh. I cried a little bit. That is just heartwarming to hear. Cuban. Here I was at school and in the 2nd grade I remember everybody turning on the TVs in the classrooms to watch the live news. It was one of the few times I saw the government not criticizing the US and actually feeling some sort of sympathy. Soon after, though, the Cuban government started using the attacks and the US reaction as another excuse to criticize the US. From that moment on, most of our daily international news were on the American invasion to Afghanistan. Thanks for your reply. It's amazing to hear about the events of 9/11 from a Cuban perspective. Slovenia. I was really young at the time and my father worked at the news station. He called my mother from his work and told her to turn on the CNN. My mother and father love watching new movies, so my mother was confused at first, asking herself why would my father recommend such horrible movie. Then she realized that was not a movie. Seems to be a recurring story, someone thinking it was from a movie at first. I remember little Russian me coming home from school, 7th grade, and seeing my mom tearing up in front of the TV. She said, "Look what's going on in the United States." I couldn't understand what she was talking about, because I was refusing to believe that the movie playing on the screen was an actual footage. Everyone I knew was deeply scared, especially taking into consideration that Russia itself had recently suffered from major terroristic attacks. It felt like the world had changed forever and nowhere was safe anymore. All major German TV channels stopped any planned program for hours and reported live from the scene. Think like a non-stop news show. One German news anchor channel was RTL. Got an award later on, I think, for managing to be composed and keeping people updated on what's going on for literally hours. The event stayed in the news for the next weeks, but normal programming was resumed the next day outside of news shows. That was Peter Klopel. He got the Grimm Prize, which can be compared to the Pulitzer Prize and is oftentimes named the German TV Oscar. Canadian naval officer from Halifax here. I was in a morning operations briefing, almost at the same time, about 0945 ADT. Blackberries and pagers began to go off throughout the room. We had received an alert from NORAD of possible multiple hijackings. As we all watched FLT 175 crash into the South Tower, we knew that America was under attack. We began to gather as much information as we could, trying to make sense of what was happening. There was a lot of conflicting information. We opened a line to NORAD and listened as people began to discuss closing US airspace. The implications for us were immense. There were hundreds of flights already in the air, on the way to the US that were already in Canadian airspace, or soon to be in Canadian airspace. These aircraft would not have enough fuel to turn around and return home. They had to land. We began a mad scramble to gather as much information as possible about every Canadian airport capable of landing commercial jet aircraft. The aircraft began to arrive before there was any official word on the closure of US airspace. We were still putting together plans and trying to contact our federal government partners in customs and the RCMP. We had a head start on them in terms of knowing what was happening and what was about to happen with the closure of US airspace. Someone began to try and tally up the number of aircraft that were still in the air and headed to North America. I recall at one point hearing the number 300 and thinking that was way too high to be accurate. We wondered how many more hijackers were in the air, whether they were on any of the inbound transatlantic flights, and what they might do when they discovered they were being diverted. The number of inbound flights kept growing. We began to worry that we might not be able to land all the aircraft headed our way. There was an undercurrent of fear that some aircraft might run out of fuel before they could land. By 1100 ADT, all airports in the 4 Atlantic provinces had been notified and were beginning to receive aircraft. For security reasons, incoming flights were told they could not land at the airports in Montreal, Toronto, and Ottawa. Over the course of the next few hours, there was a constant stream of aircraft arriving. 239 aircraft and 33,000 passengers were diverted that day to a handful of small and medium-sized airports. In Gander, Newfoundland, the number of passengers arriving exceeded the entire population of the town. The next 3 days were incredibly challenging, but they made me incredibly proud to be Canadian. Canadians, and especially Atlantic Canadians, opened their homes to strangers, providing food, clothing, toiletries, comfort and compassion. I was in Shanghai when it happened. I remember watching CCTV, the national agency, and when they were showing images and scenes of what was happening, they were playing really wacky and comical music. I remember thinking, is this a joke? Then my friend who was watching with me commented on the exact same thing. It was so surreal how they were showing it. The music was like something they play in a really cheesy candid camera show. To this day one gets strange reactions from Chinese whenever 9/11 is mentioned there. I remember kids in my class smirking when I mentioned it while teaching social studies in Shaanxi. I quickly changed the subject, but I can't help but remember the complete lack of empathy. So not exactly what you were asking, as I am from the US. But I lived in England as a military brat when the 2 towers were hit. The Air Force base that my dad was stationed at immediately shut down all non-essential activities. This included schools, groceries and shopping. Because of this, for the first time since we had moved to the UK, my family and I had to get our groceries on the economy. I remember grocery shopping the day after the attacks. My mom and I were still pretty shaken up, and it was obvious that others were as well. We ran into a friend of mine while at the grocery store, and my mom had stopped to talk to her mom. They spoke in whispers of the attack, as if the tragedy was too new to really give voice to. It was at this point that a British woman, upon recognizing us as Americans, walked up to our families and tearfully said, "I am so sorry for your tragedy, and you should know that we will be behind your country the entire way." I don't know why, but that memory in particular sticks in my head beyond any other memory of the days surrounding the attacks. Christ, that made me tear up. I freaking love our Commonwealth allies. Well, I'm Ethiopian, and unfortunately this terrible act of terror had to happen on the day all Ethiopians celebrate the New Year. I was 13 at that time, and I remember I was with my family and friends celebrating the holiday. Suddenly there was a breaking news on the TV, and the night just simply changed from celebration to sadness with a sense of absolute disbelief. As the event was unfolding and when the WTC starts to fall, I could only remember my mother just shouting the words "why" while her eyes welled with tears. That was just a dreadful day that will never be forgotten by Ethiopians. As we celebrate New Year's Day, we will always remember the sorrow of the USA on that day as well. So, Finland. The university year starts around the start of September. 2001 was my first. When it's 9ish in America, it's evening already in Finland. So the 11th of September, 2001, I was at my student apartment, reading a book. Didn't have a TV. Had a radio. Didn't turn it on because nothing ever happens. Didn't have internet yet. Didn't talk with the neighbors either. So the next morning, the 12th of September, I come to the university for a mechanics lecture. I sit next to a sly recent acquaintance. He grins too widely and banters nervously. "So, was it you?" What I ask. "I have no idea." As he repeats the question, I begin supposing someone has done something outrageous, like painted the city hall pink overnight. Did he really think I was a practical joker type, or was this the small talk thing I had heard about? Then he takes a sheet of paper, draws 2 towers, a plane, an arrow, explains, draws another plane, then another, and I start to feel bad. The lecturer, when he comes in, comments something to the effect that despite the events, We should try to concentrate on the course if we can, though he understands if that is difficult. The only time I can remember when a lecturer even alluded to an event in the outside world. After 2 hours of mechanics and anxiety, I beeline for the university library and the newspaper room and grab everything in Finnish or English that I can find. The Finnish newspapers deal with the event with infographics, timelines, sidebars of statements from world leaders, spreads and spreads of small articlets documenting bits of fact and supposition, very calmly and clearly, without any emotion, with a few photographs and a lot of vector graphics. First plane hit, second plane hit, first building collapsed, Pentagon hit, German Chancellor condemns the attacks, suspects include, death toll estimated to be in the range of. I spend an hour there, mouth hanging open, and resolved to start listening to radio from now on. Everyone was really subdued, but anxious. The university had these small TVs set up here and there that usually showed internal info. This was one time they showed soundless news. I ran into an Anglophone exchange student, possibly American, who was really distraught and looking for someone to talk to or at, and there I, a total stranger in the hallway, was. I couldn't say anything except agree that it was horrible. It was disorienting enough for me. The second week away from home, I can't imagine what it must have been like for him. Possibly the second week in a different country, where you don't speak the language, then you walk past a TV screen and, oh. Singapore. We're about 12 hours time difference from the US. I was at home. Family was glued to the TV till early in the morning. I was in the next room flitting back and forth. I heard my father yell when the first tower fell. I was really young then. I woke up to the sounds of my parents talking and my mom yelling when the third towers fell as well. New Zealand. It was on all day long. A news anchor, John Campbell I believe, got some kind of recognition for staying in studio for 12 plus hours covering it. Also, we still had to sit our English exam that day, which was a bit crap. Greece. It was top story for a few days like in most European countries. The main reaction was shocked disbelief. At one point, we saw on the TV that a lot of smoke covered the city for some reason. It took our reporters, and us, a full 15 feet to realize that the towers had actually fallen. Greek here. In addition to that, because there were 45 Greeks that died that day, people were outside of USA Embassy in Athens and Thessaloniki trying to ask information about their closed ones in NYC. UK here. At home before starting college. It was live on TV on channels which normally had news, so BBC, ITV, Channel 4. I remember my friend called me after the first plane hit and said, dude, someone flew a plane into a tower in America. What a dong, or something along those lines. I don't think people thought it was anything sinister until the second plane hit. I certainly didn't. I presumed a pilot was drunk or something happened with the plane's guidance systems and it was an accident more than anything else. When the second plane hit, my dad ran out of his office with a very serious look on his face and just gawped at the TV frowning. That's when I knew that crap was real and this wasn't an accident but something coordinated and premeditated. The news reports were trying to keep it calm. Props to BBC for staying cool and trying to focus on facts such as where the plane came from, where it was going, who was on board, how much fuel was left, that sort of thing. The number of fatalities was of course mentioned from the initial crashes because passengers couldn't have survived and manifest showed how many souls were on board. I don't remember any conjecture or speculation about what this meant in the bigger picture because at that time, just as the planes hit, there wasn't anyone to blame. I don't remember the actual towers falling, but I do remember seeing the headlines for the other downed planes near the Pentagon and the other one further afield, but felt that these two instances weren't reported on after the first couple of hours. Australia. 24/7 live coverage. I remember being really impressed with the news crews and all the public speeches made by the world leaders at the time. I was 11 at the time and this was the day I realized that the world was cruel. Everyone was talking about it and there was a whole school assembly to talk about it and counselors were brought in to talk to the kids. A lot of people I knew refused to go to Sydney, Melbourne or Brisbane for a long time once Australia went to war with the US. Everyone was scared of being in the big cities and train and airport security became relentless for years. When the Bali bombings happened the following year, it really struck hard again that Australia isn't sheltered by isolation. A hard lesson after growing up where nothing bad happened near us. Once Australia went to war with the US, might need to amend that to alongside the US. In Australia, close to 24-hour news for a day. Channel 10 was the first station to take a break to show The Simpsons. Then back to 24-hour news for the next day or so as things trailed off. Early reports were naturally pretty sensationalist. America under attack, which it was, but not in the sense of an invasion. Lots of scrabbling for answers. The Taliban was identified pretty early on, though. Nothing could stop Channel 10 from showing 6 o'clock Simpsons. I miss it. Pakistan. All I heard was, 2 towers were hit in USA by planes and are completely destroyed. It was all over the news, but I don't think they were showing it again and again and again. Later on, when USA planned to go Afghanistan saying they are responsible for 9/11 incident, it was all over news again because Pakistan was also supporting USA because we were hurt in many ways. Netherlands. We were playing football and all our parents suddenly picked us up. KNRW something big was up, but boy was IP. I loved football. HUMD couldn't comprehend what had happened, but all older people were very serious and the atmosphere was tense. All over the news for weeks. Ireland. Personal story rather than how the nation viewed it. At the time I was a hotel manager. On this particular day we had the wedding of an American man and an Irish woman. Both were US Armed Forces personnel serving in Germany. An awful lot of the wedding guests were military, as you can imagine. There were a couple of captains and majors and one colonel at the wedding. The wedding took place at 12 noon GMT, and immediately after the service the wedding party themselves went somewhere for photos. The bulk of the guests arrived at the hotel for TC sandwiches, drinks at 2 PM GMT. The planes struck the tower at 1.45 and 2.03 GMT respectively. The sudden change from a celebratory mood to fear, anger, shock and horror was something to behold. I won't go through the rest of the day, but I can remember a major in the bar late that night at around 2 AM or so. The news channel was on and showing Palestinians celebrating in the streets. Someone asked him if he thought they were responsible. He replied, "I really hope they are not, because whoever did this really miscalculated and we will never stop looking for them." I remember thinking it was interesting that a military man said looking for them, as if he was talking about a group and not a nation state. He knew that no nation was stupid enough to sanction or take part in an attack on US soil. I still think about that wedding every September. Hope the bride and groom have a happy life and celebrate their anniversary as anyone else would. Greece. As a tragedy, of course. 40 Greeks, people of Greek descent, died that day, in addition to all the 3,000 casualties. Affair it was on the news headlines for more than 2 weeks. Moment of silence in sports every day for at least a week. People on the streets were praying for the souls of their relatives that were on NYC at the time and going outside of US Embassy in Athens and Thessaloniki trying to ask about their closed ones. This is actually a really cool thread, coming from an American here. I was young and on the southeast side of the country when it happened, so it didn't hit me too hard, but I'm just now beginning to understand the global impact because of this thread. I never understood how many countries stood behind us. I always thought, we're America, everybody hates us. Aside from Canada, we're alone in this, but we'll be okay. But no, now I get it. Canada, Australia, Germany, UK, everyone else. I know it doesn't mean much, but I want to send a genuine thank you to all of you. Thank you for standing behind America in our darkest hour. It's a notion that civilians won't be forgetting anytime soon. Give us a nod and we'll be behind you, too. I can't speak for our politicians, but our general public will help how we can. Everything Starscream said and more. A heartfelt thank you. And yes, we'll always have your backs, too. You can count on it. I live in the UK, and as I understand it, the American TV channels were showing unedited raw footage of the towers. At first the BBC did the same thing, but eventually they switched to edited footage, I guess because the raw footage was too gruesome. Other than that stark difference, on the actual day of the attacks things were mainly trying to be explained. There was so much confusion, and people were panicking that something might happen in London. So generally the BBC was just trying to give out as much information as possible. One thing that struck me was how they remarked that the Queen was safe. That is interesting. I hadn't really thought about how they would have scrambled heads of state outside the US to safety. In Iran, there were candlelight vigils all over the country. There was a moment of silence at a soccer game as well. The way I remember, they focused mostly on the loss of life. Innocent people clearly never deserve a fate like that. Norwegian here. A moment of silence the day after. It was on TV all day, every day for weeks. I was 13 at the time. Came home from school and was about to do my homework. A friend texted me that a plane had hit the World Trade Center. Thinking it was a small plane, like a Cessna, I turned on CNN. Apparently 2 airliners had crashed into the towers. I watched both towers collapse live on TV. I sent a text to my dad saying the towers have collapsed. I think this means war. I didn't know that 6 years later I would be in Afghanistan, in the Norwegian QRF. Thank you for helping us. I live in the Romanian countryside. I was 11 at the time. It happened at around 4 PM, and when the news began airing the event, everyone was at home watching it. Neighbors were calling to tell us to turn on the TV. Every TV channel showed the footage of the attacks for days after. My father is an Orthodox priest who has never met an American citizen, and when he saw the news he began crying, saying that innocent people shouldn't die like this. Czech Republic. I was 7 at the time, but can't quite remember. All day news on the matter, and I remember my parents being kinda bummed about the situation. No panic, no cries. They didn't stop because of that, but it was just generally a sad event. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.